Okay, well, it's 15 past the hour, so let's get started. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's been a long week. Definitely a great party last night. I don't know if you enjoyed some of the rides, but I definitely had fun. It's going to be tough to go home tonight and tell my kids that, yes, I was in Disneyland. And someone reminding me I wasn't born and raised in the U.S., but I should be ashamed to go in Disneyland first without my kids. So I don't know how I'm going to spin that, but I'll figure it out. First, thank you for coming. Again, I know it's been a long week, and you're probably reaching the point where you're ready to collapse with all those PowerPoints that you've seen, and you still have a little bit to go. So thanks for coming. And just to set expectations, this session is definitely technical. It's 300, but it's a lot of it has to do with the theory of deploying Project Server into a farm and the technicalities, what's so special about the application, meaning that I've got a lot of slides, and I don't have a lot of demo because, I think demoing, installing Project Server is not, it's fun, but I don't think you're going to get a lot of value out of that. Plus, we'll get videos to do that. So again, just to set expectation, a lot of slides. And again, because it's Wednesday afternoon, I want to try to make this interactive. Now, there's a lot more people than I was expecting, which is a good sign. So if you can just, come to the mic, ask your questions, and hopefully I'll answer that. And unfortunately, I can talk about the topic all day, but I only have 72 minutes remaining, so let me just get moving. So my point is, at one point, I might cut you off and say, let's postpone that till the end. I'm not expecting you in 75 minutes to become an expert at deploying Project Server, but hopefully I'll give you, whether you're system integrators, whether you're an ISV, or whether you're customers, at least principles and best practices so you can go ask IT, or if you are a consultant, you can go recommend your customer how to get started on a good footing on Project Server 2010. So again, if you got outstanding questions following these sessions, please feel free to contact me. I put all the usual social stuff, and including my Microsoft email here on the main slide. I'm, again, Christophe Huysinger. I'm based in Redmond. I'm part of the product marketing team for Project Server, and pretty much working alongside those my great SharePoint peers that put together this event. And just to, again, set the expectation and set the stage, we're pretty committed to this product at Microsoft to the point that from an engineering perspective, the project engineering group actually reports to Jeff Teeper, which all of you saw on stage at the keynote. And the marketing thing, it's the same thing. We're totally aligned in terms of readiness, and that's why, for instance, we have a bunch of project sessions at the SharePoint conference, and we'll have SharePoint sessions at our coming event, which I'll talk about later, which is our project conference. So, here's the clicker. So what am I going to talk about today? Let me ask you a question before I go to the agenda. How many of you have seen or deployed Project Server 2010? Okay, not everyone. That's good. So again, for some of you, you might not learn anything new. Hopefully, some of it might be reminders. For the one that haven't seen it, I'll go over very briefly of what it's about. But obviously, at this stage in the game, and we actually had a couple of great sessions so far on, how can you connect developers and a PMO. And that was a session I gave yesterday, and someone was still asking questions. So that's good. I think it's a good validation of the interest. Just before this, there was a session on how do I manage innovation within my company using SharePoint and Project Server by Simon Floyd. We had a session on can you do SharePoint governance, on how can you manage large change requests with Scott Jamison on Monday. So hopefully you're all here because you're convinced that potentially there's a value in this product. And again, I'm here to teach you, okay, what's next to set it up and start on a good footing from an IT pro perspective. The agenda, I'm going to start with the architecture. And again, for some of you, it might not be new, but I'm going to, again, stress what is the standard Project Server architecture in this 2010 wave that we shipped over a year ago. And more importantly, what makes it special. And from that, you'll see how that's a great segue in terms of whether you're doing capacity planning or whether you're trying to make a decisions of where do you put that PMO, or if you're in IT, that finance that's asking you for a project management system, where should you put it? Should you put it in your central intranet with central farm, or should you spin up a separate farm? And that's a segue to the next topic, which I get very often, which is, again, should I put project server in my existing infrastructure where I've got redundancy at the web front end, I've got redundancy at the middle tier, I've got a nice server rack like we had on stage on Monday, et cetera, et cetera. Or again, should I just put a server under my favorite PM, my favorite project manager, and say, here you go. Here's project server, you own the server, and you can apply service pack. So I'm going over the, what are the pros and cons, and I'll try to be fairly pragmatic, because really the answer, it depends. But hopefully it'll help you, whether you're in IT and trying to make a decision on behalf of your business unit asking for this application, or if you're a consultant and you're trying to make a recommendation to your favorite customer. And then once you've pretty much, once I've walked you through all those theory, I'll start talking a little bit about, okay, great, I'm convinced. I think we should do offer as a service to our business groups internal to my company. And the next question is, how many servers? So I'll go over that. And then, how many of you actually still have customers or still have entities within your org that have Project Server 2007? A couple hands. Well, actually, quite a few. So I'll go over, what's the upgrade path? And you might be wondering, maybe some of you, how about 2003? And, I didn't cover it, but we've got a lot of content. So remind me if, for those of you that felt left out because I didn't cover migration from 2003, because we do have answers and content for you. And I'll wrap up with one of the topics that I always like to remind everyone, whether it's a customers or partners, or when I get on the calls with a customer. We at Microsoft, we make it very easy to deploy, whether it's a desktop application, whether, I don't know, Word or Excel, and it's very easy to deploy a server. It's even easier in 2010, a little couple PowerShell command, and in 2 minutes, voila, you get a FAM up and running. But what people tend to forget is, that's where the fun starts. So just don't go home and think it's over, because what's going to happen if you're a consultant and you stood up that farm and you leave, in a year, potentially the customer is going to call Microsoft saying, my homepage is just horrendous. My CFO who needs to look at those strategic set of projects with cost attributes, blah, 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 can't load the page, et cetera, et cetera. So just a couple of reminders that hopefully I'm preaching to the choir, but it's a couple of things you need to put in place as good hygiene when you go in production. And you'll see a lot of those recommendations. This is nothing specific to Project Server. Hopefully that's the same hygiene you would have, let's say, for your mission-critical email system, or for your mission-critical accounting system, or CRM, or SharePoint. Okay, so let's get started. Before I start, I'd like to remind everyone that, again, Project Server, whether it's the server or the desktop, we're part of the Microsoft Office division, which means we ship at the same cadence. So the 2010 version that I'm talking about today, we shipped that version. We were RTM, released to manufacturing, May of last year. And the point I'm making is we've been in market for a year and a half. We also learned, based on prior launches like 2007 and 2003, that it's not just good to ship a product that adds business value to our users, and it's not good enough to ship a high-quality product if we don't give you documentation, like if you're in IT on TechNet, or if you're a developer, a solid SDK to get started, or just an end user. How do I get started? What is that portfolio analysis Microsoft keeps talking about? And I think we've delivered quite a bit on that front. And what I wanted to highlight is, again, a year and a half into in market, like we say at Microsoft. There's a colleague here on the IT Pro team, technical writers, that has actually, he noticed that there was so much content that we built, whether it's white papers or just standard articles on TechNet and videos, that now it's the opposite. Unlike prior version, it's not, whereas this content is, how do I find this content in this maze of content that Microsoft not only ship at RTM, but keeps revving on a regular basis. And he built this sexy-looking content pivot viewer, and again, it's using Silverlight, where again, you can start looking at themes that, planning, the traditional planning themes that we have on TechNet. And here it shows you all the assets, and I can, filter. Maybe I'm kind of tired. It's Wednesday afternoon, and I just want to look at training. Here's the videos or whatever. And then I can click on each one of those. I'm not going to click on those because there's a familiar face on those. Let's pick a document. Anyway, you can go there and get content. So the first point, there's a lot of content out there. I'll give you a lot of links in the presentation available for download. And then the second point is we're always looking for feedback. And on all those pages in TechNet, this is nothing specific to project, but if we're missing something, let us know. And pretty much like if we have a bug, let us know, we'll fix it. If we're missing something in our documentations, and I already had a couple questions earlier when I was at the booth, let us know, and we'll tell the technical writers, document this topology, this scenario, because we haven't done so. So let me switch back to the slides, and let's get started. Okay, so I promise this is the only marketing slide. After that, we dive into the technical stuff. But since not everyone raised their hand, hopefully at the next SPC, everyone will raise their hand. Basically, 2010 is a big release for us. We like to say on the desktop side, for your PMP certify, your traditional project manager, we now have the ribbon. We've got very rich visualization. We think it's like the biggest release in 10 years. That's for the desktop, the practitioner. On the server, we pretty much like SharePoint 2007 to SharePoint 2010 we didn't really re-architect everything, but we took a lot of feedback where it's, make it easier to maintain, make it easier to administer, or make it easier to use. We now have the ribbon in our web app. We have rich business intelligence on insights using Excel services, performance point services. And then we also, so besides making the end user happy, whether you're the practitioners or just a contributor, within IT, let's say I'm doing my timesheets, but also for the executives, we added capabilities around what I mentioned earlier, which is portfolio analysis. And again, if you haven't seen it, we keep talking about it, for instance, earlier in the context of how do I triage a bunch of ideas in my organization in a programmatic way without too much of the emotion that I used to do when I was just a closed-door meeting with everyone in IT trying to make a decision. That's also, again, the same topic that I use on Monday with Scott Jameson on, how do I evaluate all those change requests we're constantly getting within IT, and how do I push back on maybe, this business unit in Anaheim, we're not going to deploy your widget because it's not as mission critical as blah that, we got to re-platform our servers, we got to go to the cloud, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the 2010 release. And pretty much as the application, like SharePoint, is becoming more and more important within organizations, we didn't stop there on just giving a very strong project portfolio management app in silos. A lot of customers ask us, Microsoft, be a good citizen on integrate with all the other server products that you ship. And that's what you're seeing at the bottom. Obviously, we integrate with SharePoint 2010. But people are saying, give me Exchange integration. So on my favorite mobile device, it's in my bag, my Mango, maybe I can update tasks while I'm traveling here, and I don't have to fire up my laptop to tell my project manager how many hours I need to do on this task. Dynamics, for those of you that have never heard it, this is our ERP suite like Axapta, SL, so we got integration with that out of the box. TFS, I'm not going to go over it. Someone asked me again. That's a session I delivered yesterday. So if you have a team of developers and from an IT perspective or from a PMO, you need to collaborate with that pocket of developers, then guess what? We shipped in March an integration between those two products. So again, the point is we're continuing to innovate based on feedbacks that you're telling us. And obviously SQL, typically the one reason why you're purchasing project server, or the one reason you want to graduate from managing work in a task list is, how about if you get thousands of task lists? How about if you got resource dependencies? So you want to capture that in a central system, and you want to capture it because you want to surface it and make decisions. So you really want to look at those nuggets, those rubies, all those valuable data that you're capturing. So we leverage a lot of the BI capabilities of SQL Server. There's a hidden slide. Again, I put it hidden because it's supposed to be 300 technical. But a recent validation of how strong this release is that Gartner, which does evaluates different software space, gave us the highest reading end of June. They gave us a strong positive in their market scope. So I put the hidden link. We purchased the rights, so you can read that up. Maybe give that to your executive to your business unit to say, here's why we need to purchase this, or here's why we need to roll it out. Any questions so far? Very quiet. Okay. So hopefully you're convinced that there's something with Project Server 2010. So how do you deploy it? And starting with the logical architecture, again, what we did is, from an engineering perspective, if you go back in history, back in the 2003 day, and that wasn't the first version, but it was a standalone ASP application. And maybe if you wanted to integrate with that thing called WSSv2 or SPS, SharePoint, you could do so after the fact. And obviously, way back then, we saw a trend that, as adoption on this collaboration around document management, it's the same thing. I'm collaborating on projects. So how about we give our users an end-to-end experience, not just collaborate on tasks, but also collaborate on documents, deliverables that you would do in SharePoint. So what I'm getting at is, in 2007, we rebuilt Project Server on top of SharePoint. So that was the 2007. We re-architected, so we became a SharePoint app, and we continue to do so in 2010. My point is, from a topology, whether you do 1 tier, 2 tier, 3 tier, it's the same as SharePoint. And I'll revisit that. At the top level, we've got different clients, typically accessing our application. Again, the most frequent, the usual suspect is Project Professional or desktop application. So, I'm the project manager, the practitioner. I'm managing the schedule. I'm building an airplane. I'm collaborating with the left wing, right wing team. I got a lot of dependencies. I live and breathe in our desktop app. I push that data to server, and then suddenly I can start seeing all the dependencies, all the potential issues and reporting that I would expect. So typically the desktop is one client that accesses our application. But obviously not everyone's a project manager, right? We need some people to execute, to do a little bit of work. And typically they do that using what we call the web app or browser. It was also called PWA in the past. And then notice how it's browsers, which is a subtle change I made in my slide, is last June, 3 months ago, when we ship SP1, we enable multi-browser supports for what we call the team members. Meaning, again, if Christoph, he's a special guy and he doesn't like to use IE, he doesn't like to use the standard PC that we've given him, or he's got a smaller screen, whatever. How about if you should still be able to do his timesheets in his favorite browser, whether it's Chrome or Safari or Firefox. So we introduced that in June. And obviously, like some of you have done here at SPC, a common scenario is that there's third-party applications accessing your data. A gentleman was asking me earlier, I want to integrate with SAP because I'm doing timesheets in SAP. Can I do so? And absolutely. So that's a very common scenario. Another questions that I got last Sunday, we did a pre-event on Project 2010, and is if I'm creating a third-party app, is it really going through the web front end and not going through the SQL directly or the middle tier? And absolutely, you're accessing at the top, whether you have 1, 2, load balance, and then it's going down the food chain to access the data. So that's the top tier. Then the web tier, again, you're probably very familiar with it. If you've seen SharePoint, this is nothing new in 2010, but you can have 1, you can have 2, you can have 3, you can have a dozen web front end. And then there is a bunch of services that obviously pushes the call back to, let's say, the middle tier to either do some calculations, render some pages, or just push data in. And that takes us to the application layer. And really, this is where we get a lot of the number crunching, a lot of the heavy lifting. And the two things I want to stress here that are important, that are special in the project server world, actually only one thing really, because you have an eventing model. So we get events, but what's very important is we get this notion of a queuing system. And that's something we introduced in 2007. And again, when we look at how people use our product, we've got this powerful capabilities in Project Server for many versions, which is called timesheeting. So very common use cases in IT or if you're a consulting firm, I want to know what everyone does, not just like Christoph do you have 40 hours remaining of work? But more importantly, Christophe, what did you do on Monday? What did you do on Tuesday? Did you do any overtime? Were you doing some training at SPC, etc.? So the way people use that is typical human nature. Instead of submitting my timesheet every day, I typically do at the very last minute on Friday because, it's a painful thing, but I still have to do that's, the policy within my company. And you would do that in 2003, and sure enough, there was no queuing. So guess what? When you get thousands of people submitting the same request, it would take the server to its knees. And basically anyone else that wasn't doing timesheets or just wants to do a report, the server was pretty much not responding because the server was on its knees trying to process all those timesheets. So we took that into account and we introduced a queuing system, which means all of you in the room, you submit your timesheets and we'll queue them up. But for, let's say, Christophe, the project manager, is just going around doing stuff in PWA, I don't even see a change in spike in terms of, the amount of time it takes a page to load. So the queuing system is something special in our world. Then we go into the bottom tier, the database tier. And here it's a very common question, which is what's special about Project Server? Do you store your data in a content database, which I'm very familiar as a SharePoint administrator? And actually, yes and no. So what you're looking at here on the slide is all the blue databases are the Project Server database. And to go further, those are per instance. I'll revisit that. But let's say I just set up PMO within IT. I've got a center of excellence for managing projects. I've got a pretty mature organizations, and I want to use this tool. So we got a first database. It's called a draft database. And typically think of, Christophe, I'm creating a plan, but I'm not sure on the estimates. I'm not sure who should be working on that plan. So I'll go back in the office and I'll talk to my colleague who's also a project manager who's done a service pack deployment. So, I push that data, it stores in the drafts. If my PC is stolen, if it's broken, whatever, the data is nice and safe in a database. And the switch from draft to the next one, publish, is, the project, I'm happy with the schedules. I've assigned Joe, Samantha, Jan, and Steven. And I'm ready to get feedback on have people doing timesheets, executing based on the homework I give them. All that data, again, like I mentioned earlier, the reason you're capturing all those things is you want to do reportings, you want to make decisions, you want to get insights. So we actually have a dedicated relational database that we actually call the reporting database, not terribly creative, where we funnel all the data. And archive is just a database you use if you're done with a project. Let's say it was a 3-year replatforming, Windows 7 rollout. You're done, you want to archive it. You don't want to completely delete the data, but you want to upload the production database. Then the next one people forget is SSAS OLAP. I apologize for the acronyms. We love acronyms at Microsoft, but it stands for SQL Server Analysis Services. And OLAP, think of decisional data, typically also called those cubes. And in the project server world, typically, we've got a lot of data, which is what we call time phase, which means we have numbers Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and I want able to give me how much capacity I've got this week, how much capacity I've got next month. Do I have enough DBA capacity in the month of January? Do I need to hire one of you as a SI because internally I've got a hiring freeze, but I know I need to deliver on all those SharePoint projects? And then so all that data, there's a lot of data. We use analysis services to drill in on that. So that's one thing that makes us special is typically when you just stand up a SharePoint farm, you don't have to worry about analysis services, right? SharePoint just needs the relational engine of SQL. Then it's hard to read with the yellow background there, but all our scheduling data, like the tasks, the resources, timesheet, all that's stored in the blue database. But then, as I said earlier, we integrate with SharePoint, so there's a lot of other artifacts, whether it's unstructured, like document library, or whether it's structured, like issues, risks, or any other custom list that you might have implemented as part of your methodology. And that's stored in SharePoint. So that's why it's not just the blue database, but to look at the complete picture, you've got definitely project server data in content database. Then you might be wondering, is it one or many? I'm just giving you the high level. And you can have multiple content database. And again, just to stress this, because I had the conversation when I was at the booth earlier, is notice the title. This is per instance. So meaning, if you stand up a project web app for IT, and then you guys are fairly mature in IT, and then you come back, or one of your business user attends SPC and attends one of those project server sessions and goes, okay, I want my PWA so I can manage innovation. Then you start multiplying. So if I've got 3 departments, then I'm going to have times 3 of those. Obviously, the config DB, you will only have 1 if you do it in a central form, but potentially you get the point that you can have a lot of database depending on how rapid the adoption is within your organization. Any questions so far? Yes? Mirroring. So the question is, do we support mirroring in 2010? Absolutely. Do we support clustering? Absolutely. Do we support log shipping? Absolutely. Sorry? Do we support what? Sorry? With OLAP? Do we support? Sorry, I didn't get the second part. Okay, so do we support high availability at the analysis services? Yeah, I see that's a great topic. It's whatever you can do high availability in analysis. You can have an active passive. I mean, typically the people where this becomes really mission critical, typically they get a relational database form, maybe like on the stage where we're doing mirroring, I believe, or clustering, and then they get another set of racks just to do analysis services, and maybe because it's mission critical, the CFO pulls sensitive numbers to build reports, and I do active, passive, whatever. So yeah, it's just, we're built on SQL, so whatever SQL gives you, whether it's for the decisional or relational engine, you'll get. Obviously, the higher the SLA, the higher the cost. And like what I like to remind everyone, the server at the database tier is the cheap part. What's expensive is storage. So if there was a question back there before I moved on.
Functionally, why is it important to keep the draft content in the database for the public content? Why do you do it?
So the question is, why, Microsoft, why did you have all those databases? The blue ones. I'm making it simple. Again, it was based on usage where, this is a client-server app. So people say, I want to store my plan nice and safe on the server, but yet I'm not ready to open it for everyone in my organization to collaborate because I'm still tweaking milestones, phases, resources. And the other question is, how do data goes from from draft to publish to, and we got a very nice diagram that explains that. But basically, typically, from an end user, when you hit publish, it pushes data, and then we got timer jobs that syncs the data continuously between those different buckets of information. So for the end user, you don't have to worry about it. For the administrator, I actually have a slide. You got to look at, we get, as I say, a queuing system. And sometimes things don't go according to plan, and the user say, I don't see my data in the report, and maybe there's a job in the queue that's not processing, throwing an exception, etc. And typically that's where potentially you should look first if the user's having issues or not seeing many timesheets. Now we took the feedback and maybe we can improve things. And again, I can't talk about the future, but this is very valid feedback. Again, historically, so the question is why separate database instead of one big one? And again, historically, when we started on the 2007 wave, we had some very, very large customers. And we thought from an efficiency, it was a lot easier to partition it. Like, just to give you an example, the reporting, if I'm doing a lot of reporting and I'm hitting it and I want to cache all those queries, you can actually put the reporting DB in a separate SQL instance. If it's really eating all your CPU. So you don't take down the farm, you don't cannibalize the existing resource for your SharePoint farm. So again, we said, we're going to potentially have millions of records of rows depending on how long I've been using the app, on the length of my projects, the number of, if you get thousands of resources. One of the largest customers is almost 50,000 users. So let's give you all the flexibility by partitioning at the database level. What's the second question before I answer?
And you guys don't use SSAS in Vertipactor today. Is that something you guys do?
Okay. So first question is, how about SSRS, SQL Server Reporting Services? I don't see it. It's because it's not required. But a lot of people, as I say, it's all about reporting. And a lot of people historically use SQL Server Reporting Services. With 2010, we're based on SharePoint 2010. So I still see people using SSRS, especially in integrated mode, but you can use Excel services, performance point services. So it's optional, but I agree, a lot of people do it because there's so much flexibility in SQL Server reporting services. And the next question was, how about Vertipack, NetAlley? I know I'm throwing words at you. Is there any plans in the future? I'm not going to talk about the future, and that's it. Oops, I'm being recorded. No, but I mean, you've seen the SharePoint BI. We discussed in the keynote. BI is key, and we're partnering with all the teams, whether it's SQL, whether it's Excel, whether it's SharePoint. Okay, just moving on because I only have 43 minutes left on about 60 slides. So again, I give you the high level, and then I'm going to say, okay, next two slides is what makes us special. That obviously is going to drive some of the decisions when you deploy it in your farm. And basically, there's two sets there's two moving parts at the high level when you deploy Project Server. There's what we call, on the left-hand side, the web app. Think of that as the shell. It's got a couple custom pages, some web parts, and all that is really storing or pushing or retrieving data from those database that I showed you that are specific to Project Server. So really, if you just look at it from a site collection, I haven't looked at it lately, but I think it's a couple meg. There's not much in there. But on the other side, you get all the subsites. And again, think, I create a project, roll out SP1 for SharePoint. And I've set up a bunch of tasks. And I create a site. And maybe I want the user acceptance test to submit a document with, make sure they've done all their work, making sure everything works on the staging environment when I've rolled out SP1. Maybe I'm in R&D, and once I reach a milestone, I want the researcher to submit a patent to my legal department, do a document workflow so we covered from the IP, etc. All that is stored in the project subsite. In a world of project, hopefully, you're rolling out Project Server because you get more than one project. So pretty quickly, you can have hundreds or thousands of more projects. And that's what you can have on the right-hand side. Now, typically, the next question is, Christoph, am I going to have hundreds, thousands of sites? And is it a one-to-one mapping to projects? It really depends. I had the questions earlier at the booth. It depends how you manage project or what is the granularity. Some people call program, like I told you, let's say you're going to roll out Windows 7 on Office 2010 and for 20,000 employees in your org. That's typically a 2 or 3 years project. Or you're going to roll out a new version of your ERP, and typically that's a program. And underneath that, there's going to be different work stream, different projects. So you might just have one subsite we've called the Windows 7 Desktop Master Program. And underneath, you're going to have a bunch of subsites. The point is, on the right-hand side, like I say, you store all the SharePoint stuff, data, whether it's structured or unstructured, like documents, PowerPoints, or structured like risk issue. And you can have many of those. I've also put as a reference all the web parts that come in our web app, and some of them also leave on the right-hand side, like a web app to do timesheets. Web part. Web part to look at all those subsites. A web part to approve timesheet or statusing for my resources, etc. I put a little link that people ask us Microsoft to document and they get in trouble is what can you do with those web parts? Meaning maybe I want to move a web part and put it in a custom page. Or maybe one of the web parts are in the parent site on the left-hand side. I want to put it in the subsite. So what's supported, what's not supported? And more importantly, if I got different site collections or different farm, what are those boundaries based on the SharePoint technologies that I can do and I cannot do? So I really, if the users or if you want to start customizing and moving around web parts, really look at that so you don't get in trouble when you do so. Just to, again, wake up everyone, just to show you what I meant by that. So pay attention because that's the only demo I have. No, seriously, it's true that it's only demo. So I'm central admin, SharePoint 2010. Let's assume I put the bits, and I've just run the PowerShell to install it. So I got all my service app. I could have done, again, just use the standard config wizard, or I could start from scratch. But by default, if I just do the installer and the config wizard, it's going to call a service app called Project Server Application. And you can have many. And underneath there, I got what we start calling, our PWA. And notice, like, one is intranet and one is a project, so you can guess 2 different site collections. And just to go one step further, let me open one up. And now I'm in the web app. So that's what I say, that's the parent one. And really, all the data, I'm seeing that. I mean, it's pulling some data from the SharePoint site, but really all the scheduling data, it's really pulling data from those project server specific database. Here's the tables, and something if I was showing you, resource center, all the resources in my org. Okay, so that's our web app. The other side that was on the right-hand side in that slide, which is all the subsite where my users collaborate throughout the life cycle of a project. Let me just change the view here. And let me just put word processing system upgrade. That sounds interesting. So I just click on that site. I know I'm going a little too fast, but again, ribbon, similar UI. As I say, from an engineering team, we're very aligned. And we want to really give you a consistent user experience, whether you're doing project management, content management, BI. And basically, I've selected a project. Again, it could be called a program, a work package, whatever is your terminology. And now I'm navigating at that level, that word processing system upgrade. And this is just by the way, our demo data set, which was released publicly when we launched a year ago. So, someone asked me earlier, can I have this sample data set so I can feel the love? And absolutely, it's publicly available. I can download it. And you can just see the value of the tool. But as I say, we got a couple specific lists that we share in the project management world called, issues, risks. And there's another one called deliverable that's this looks like the site template get customized. So all that data, obviously, that's stored in a content database. Okay? Any questions so far? Yes? So the question is, what are the pros and cons of doing one instance or multiple instances? And, it's such a common topic that I've already asked someone internally to see if we can spin out a white paper. But I'm going to give you the very simple answer because very large customers asked me the same question at the booth. Think of an instance of a set of resources. I've got a pool of resources. Let's say all of IT, or you're a system integrator, all your consultants that are doing SharePoint deployment. And maybe I want to put them in Project Server because I need to do that resource modeling, capacity planning. Do I need to hire? Do I need to fire? Or is Christoph understaffed and maybe you should get trained or something so I really get 100% utilization? So the question I was telling this customer is, probably your R&D department is going to have a very different methodologies. And maybe they don't care what all the researchers are doing every day versus in IT, you do care. Are you using everyone's to their capacity? Meaning that, do I want all the researchers model alongside all the IT resources? Maybe, maybe not. Because I don't need to make a decision that spans an R&D project and an IT project. As soon as you break it away, you say, okay, R&D, mission sensitive, very sensitive data. I don't want anything to leak. We're working on very futuristic technology and products. I don't want anyone at IT that I just don't trust. Not that I don't trust because I don't know them. So I want to really put a big fence around that strategic multi-million-dollar data that I'm managing every day. So maybe I'm going to put it separate instance just for R&D, or in this case, separate was one for the intranet. As soon as you do that, to finish your question is, well, how about if I've got resources in R&D and I've got resources in IT and somehow they collaborate, or at the CEO level or the CFO or the CIO, they have enough researchers to deliver on all those V1, V2 of our products, and do have enough IT capacity to keep the light, to make sure we're efficient, we're on top of our game. Then to do that, if you've gone separate instance, it becomes a BI challenge, which is, yeah, you can use SSRS. Back to the question, you can build a data warehouse. You can pull using Excel services, or you can be, depending on what exactly you need, you can have two web parts side by side. One pulls from one instance and another one from another instance. You can pull data from your ERP system using BCS and Duet and et cetera, et cetera. So it really depends how far do you want the coupling. Is the executive just want to see do you have enough capacity, or if the executive wants to say not just so much am I under or over capacity, but I want to start making decisions on reallocating resources, then if you get different instance, it's not automatic. If you're in single instance, you can do that. So that, that's hopefully a long answer to a very good questions. And again, because we've heard it, we'll come up with a white paper. But it really depends at what level of granularity do you want to manage resources within the department.
So it's more business requirement,
Scaling, we can, again, 50,000 users, I think, is the maximum. So, I don't know how big is your company, but hopefully it's not so much scaling, is what are you trying to achieve with this tool? What type of decision? Are you looking at IT capacity? You're trying to improve efficiency. In R&D, the customers that use in R&D, especially the one I work with in Europe, typically it's multi-million-dollar projects, and the CFO is very interested into how am I tracking on the R&D spend so I can get potentially credits and et cetera, et cetera. So it depends. What are you after? In R&D, you don't look so much at capacity because, you're not in the service business. Whereas in IT, in the service business, you really care every day to have enough people to maintain my SharePoint form when I'm goofing off in Anaheim. So it really depends the answer. But as soon as you part and you do different instance, then suddenly you can't make those cross-company decisions. Okay, let me move on because I only have 31 minutes and still out of slides. So yeah, you can have, I've seen customers, just to finish, I've seen very large customers that again, they say, okay, Microsoft has continuously invested and continuously innovated. I have faith in the SharePoint platform. I declare SharePoint being my platform for collaboration. I'm going to give that as a service internally, not just IT, but all my business units. And I'm going to do the same thing with Project Server. I've seen customers with dozens of those instances. To IT, it's just spin off another service. Okay, you can only put 15 people, and you won't be able to see what your neighbor does, but at least I'm giving you an infrastructure, and then if that's sufficient, that's good enough. So just to recap, I think I've hit a lot of these, which is what's specific about Project Server 2010. Analysis, we already talked about that. Reporting services is optional. Queue service, again, I'm mentioning that because that's how we handle those very large load, and that's how we replicate data between all those databases. And that's something that you need to look at. Another question that I get asked is, Christophe, you show me a service app. Should I have one service app per instance? Or like in this case, I have two instances for a service app. Every time you spin up a service app, that's not Project Server specific, but it's going to consume a little CPU, a little RAM. For some of the service app in SharePoint, you get another database. So, if you got half a dozen, maybe you're good with a service app. If you're in the hosting business, maybe you want to do one for 50 or whatever. Or if your customers really want tight security isolation, maybe you do one per one. But just remember that if you have a dozen teams that need their own specific island web app, if you do a dozen service app, that's 12 times the CPU, the RAM, etc. So typically the recommendation is start with one and monitor. unless there's a security requirement to isolate at the service app level. And if you think one team is just taking everyone to its knees, then isolate that team. But you can easily do that after the fact. A little PowerShell, obviously you get a little downtime, but so start with one. Resource pool, I've already talked about. What's important about here is, again, you've got this notion where you're modeling everyone in your team, department, org. And because you want to make those decisions of staffing, capacity, etc. And to bring all that information, typically people set up Active Directory sync, like you would do, hopefully a lot of you with SharePoint. So you get all those resources, and you get what we call name resources, which is Christoph, the Microsoft guy, and you can have Joe the SQL DBA, etc. And then we also have generic resources. And I've seen people change that, or more importantly, that leads to the bullet right underneath it, is change the authorization in SharePoint. And we've got a very specific model that's pretty advanced, and that comes from that parent root site, which is PWA. So, if you change viewing rights, who's a contributor in the subsite, the next day you come, you're going to see that permission overwritten by default, unless you stop the sync. So you just look at how, and again, I put the links on all those things so you can really understand what I'm getting at. But just don't go assume that the permission and authorization is the same as SharePoint. It's a little more flexible. And the reason is, historically, again, in the mature organization, PMO, they want to do authorization by, let's say, resource breakdown structure. They want to do authorization by project. So historically, people have been asking, give me a very fine way of managing who can see what based on their roles in terms of security groups. I'm not saying you should go all out on this. I'm just saying you can go very far in terms of security model. Next bullet, we don't support multi-tenant. And I want to stress that to all of you since you're here at the SharePoint conference. And I put the link. Again, if you're looking for justification, that's the link to TechNet. It's not just Christoph speaking in Anaheim. Cross-farm services not supported. Same thing. It's if you're going to go different farm, and similar to SharePoint, not all services work. Not all SharePoint workloads can do cross-farm. Can be configured as a cross-farm service.
Is that just for Project Server web app, or assume purposes from the farm?
Okay, so the question is that just for the project server? Yes, just the project server. So yeah, if you get search or management data, thank you very much. Yeah, you can have that as a dedicated key for your entire organization. You're just pulling it. Absolutely. Yeah, this is just for project server. Web browser, I already mentioned it. Initially at RTM, we only supported IE7 on 98. Since then, we have IE9. And since SP1, we've opened it up to Chrome, Safari, and Firefox. I put the link, if you're asking me which version of each, I put the link to that. Good. Okay, good. Someone's paying attention. Thanks. Yeah, I got USB keys here. And it's for the team member. Again, we had to prioritize, and we didn't enable multi-browser for all the scenarios. Like, to do a portfolio analysis, I still need IE. But again, typically in an org, you only have so many people that make decisions or PM, and the vast majority are contributors. But we heard the feedback that we can continue to improve and maybe enable more browsers, more scenarios, and more importantly, more devices. Must be installed on each application server. I'll revisit that. But basically, people ask me, okay, I got 6 web front end at the top, 4 at the middle at the business layer logic. Do I need to put project server on 6 plus 4, 10? And typically, the underlying question is, how many licenses do I need to purchase? And yes, you need to put the bits on all those servers. At the web front end, it's like SharePoint. Because it's load balanced, I need to be able to have total, it needs to be a mirror, each one of them. So when one node fails, request is redirected, whoever's alive, and to the user it's transparent, but it's seamless. At the middle tier, obviously you enable roles in SharePoint. So just because you get the bits doesn't mean our services and our queue are running everywhere, but you still need the binaries. And then I put also the link that we get quite often is Christoph. All this theory, I'm not in the business of managing servers. I'm in the business of whatever, manufacturing this or et cetera. What are the options from hosting? And I put the link, on our site, we put all the hosters. There's actually some here in this sunny region, or maybe not so sunny today, of the US. But I just got back from an international trip in Korea on Australia last week, and I met hosters down there. So there's a lot of dedicated hosting worldwide, depending on where you are. Yes? Yeah, everything can be load balanced. Well, actually, I'll get a slide later on. Yeah. Web front end, you do software load balancing or hardware. Middle tier, SharePoint does the load balancing. That's one of the big new things that SharePoint 2010 delivered that you couldn't do in 2007. Whereas one node at the middle tier failed, there was no notion of heartbeat. We shipped that. And because we built on SharePoint, same for us. If one of the two middle tier running project server, if one fails, then the request from the WFE will go to that, the one who's alive and kicking. So a high availability, thanks, that's a perfect segue to this, which is you can go gangbuster on high availability. Typically, small farm, hopefully, most of you, let me finish this and answer the question, is you have at least 2 servers. I'm not going to check. Please separate the database, whether it's analysis services or reporting services, from the web front end. And the most common scenario is people combine WFE and the business logic. And then sometimes, again, that leads to the medium form is maybe I'm combining the WFE with the business logic, but I still want a high availability, so I've got 2 of those, right? And I just load balance. Still with a SQL. And then the very high end, yes, you can have, if you look at the right-hand side, I've got whether blah, 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 9. And maybe I've got 2 of those middle tier running the project service, 1 running search, and maybe 1 running Excel services, because I love building reports. And maybe I've got clustering, mirroring, whatever, 3 nodes and the SQL end. So you can go exactly like we do in SharePoint based on what is your SLA and what you told the business or how mission critical is. As I say, when very quickly you're going to have to add numbers in terms of cost, and really don't forget to estimate the cost of storage because racks are very cheap these days, but storage is still it's a big part of your expense as you increase your SLA to your customer. I also put this reminder. I know hopefully I'm preaching to the choir, but again, I've talked to a customer recently that didn't know what staging or sandbox or user acceptance was, and they got in trouble. And there was no way of rolling back, and obviously that took down their web app. So, I'm not saying this is the exhaustive list. You might have 3 or 2 or 1 or more, but I'm saying please, 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 look at the guidance. And again, this is not project server specific. This is not SharePoint specific. For any mission, I'm assuming for your accounting system, hopefully you don't just roll out software updates in production. You got some sort of test or staging. So same thing, when you're doing your capacity planning, don't just count the number of production server, but add a couple to play with, whether it's test, dev, staging, etc. And you might be wondering, physical, virtual? I'll get back to that. So again, common question is, okay, Christoph, I heard this 2010 alert. Gartner says it's a landmark release because it is built on SharePoint 2010. Should I tell that PMO that's really bugging me about this? Should I say, here's a server, put it under your desk? Or should I say, we're going to control, we're going to govern what's going on within our org, and we're not going to let proliferations of farms and servers. So we're going to put it in that central SharePoint farm, which has high availability, which has redundancy at all tiers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I'll try to answer. So basically, the little terminology when we talk about together or coexistence, which is all in one farm, and a part of standalone, which is that web app, separate farms, separate servers, whether it's 1 or 20. What I like to remind everyone is, if PMO is screaming very hard from one of my business unit to get it yesterday, and say, okay, here's a rack, and this is all for you, and you'll get a farm. At the end of the day, you're going to be installing SharePoint 2010 anyway, right? Because we're built on SharePoint 2010. So don't think you're just going to install Project Server. You're duplicating a full SharePoint 2010 farm. So don't think you're skipping a step. You can't. And then I put in, what can you mix? You cannot put Project Server 2010 on a SharePoint 2007 farm. And the reverse is true. You cannot install Project Server 2007 on a SharePoint 2010 farm. And the reason I'm saying that is, again, if suddenly someone in finance is suddenly say, okay, we're going to, for this next fiscal year, we're going to manage those $100 million of R&D using Project Server, and maybe your intranet's still on SharePoint 2007, and a lot of you raise their hand, and again, it's a very common case for customers. It takes time for IT to approve the new standards, whether it's Windows Server, SQL, and SharePoint 2010, but that team cannot wait. The good thing is, maybe I'm going to give them 2 racks or physical, virtual in my data center. And the good thing is, if they go their own way because they cannot wait, then the good thing is you can bring them back in line like all my SharePoint app later on in the cycle. So don't think, stress too much. Should we put in a single farm, but that single farm is only going to be live in 2 years or next year? You can easily start your own way, and then you can combine those. So that's supported. And also put a link to a white paper that explains also back to the question, multiple instance, one instance, what are the pros and cons. So I'll just give you 2 slides on pros and cons of together. So again, SharePoint as a service, and within that I've got a workload Project Server. So I got a farm with high availability, lot of servers. The advantages is, obviously, I got one farm, and I can consolidate those rogue servers sitting under the PMO, sitting in that business unit in California. Content management is a big one. Let's say I want to govern, I want to use, search, etc. As soon as I've got a rogue instance, and sometimes it's very critical, the document you're capturing in that PMO. Again, it could be patent filing, it could be specifications, it could be IT postmortem, whatever. I'm going to have to reapply all that stuff in that separate farm. So if you're very mature and you get high demand for that PMO in terms of content management, you will say, okay, let's bring it on. Not to mention compliance and security, et cetera, et cetera. Administrative and maintenance, obviously, as soon as you go apart, you might wash your hands if you're in IT and say, okay, Christophe, the PMO, here's the server, but handshake or sign something, you're on your own now. You patch it, you go to SharePoint conference, you read TechNet, but now guess what? You might be a PMO, but now you also graduated as an IT admin on Learn PowerShell. And so, it could be good or bad. Christophe might be happy or not so happy. The good thing about putting in a farm, again, you've invested significant amount of dollars or euros, whatever, and you can leverage that high availability instead of duplicating things. And as I like to remind everyone, Project Server is a service app. So, back someone was mentioning you still have multiple database. And, there's definitely improvements we can do in better alignment with SharePoint. And we've delivered that in 2010. Obviously, we're not going to stop. But, as I said, from Microsoft, the Project Server team reports to Jeff Teeper. So we're aligned. So if you like 2010, hopefully you like the future. So we're a service app. We're not just a rogue, never server. We're built on top of SharePoint. Disadvantages, just to give the 2 sides of the coin, obviously software updates, meaning everyone's marching in the same order. If the PMO is screaming for SP1 for 2010 because I got users that are using Safari, but ITs want to wait for, let's say, the October CU to just roll out a change, then the PMO has to wait, right? Because you patch everyone at the same cadence. Training, obviously, suddenly you as the SharePoint administrator, which, by the way, in the past were probably the Exchange administrator, now you're graduating, you have another line on your resume, which is Project Server administrator. So, get a little training, and I got a slide on where to get some of the training. Additional licenses required. Remember, I had 5 web front end on 4 at the middle tier. So 5 plus 4, you need 10, Christophe is tired. You need 9 server licenses in your farm. And you'll see that's a double-edged sword, because just because you go separate farm doesn't mean it's cheaper. And hopefully you're guessing why. So going apart, obviously I got total flexibility in terms of update. PMO wants SP1, sure, roll it out in your 2-server farm. Us on the internet, we'll do it in December with the December CU. Change management, yeah, you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. It's your environment. Security isolation, that might be a good advantage. Again, and back to the R&D example I was giving, is I've seen customers with very sensitive data, pharmaceutical or technology, that don't want to take the risk. They don't want some SharePoint admin that is an admin for many things. They really want just the server isolated within that department and the farm. So and I've seen that also in military. The good thing is even though you separate the web front end on the business logic, if you want to leverage that very expensive Rolls-Royce with clustering, mirroring, and those nice server racks, you can still potentially maybe converge at the database tiers, so you don't totally duplicate everything. Disadvantage, hopefully it's pretty straightforward. You get more things to worry about, or you tell that PMO they have to worry about. You wash your hands. Depends what is the procedure in your company. Content management, again, they're on their own, so potentially you're going to have duplicate things, or you're going to have documents that are not going to abide by your SOX compliance or whatever compliance you need to follow as an org. And greater cost, like I said, the other one might be more expensive, but here as well. Again, if I got 9 servers in my intranet for SharePoint, but that PMO has 9, and I remember I told you we're built on SharePoint, you need to buy another 9 SharePoint server license. So you got 18 now, right? So the math sometimes, it's not necessarily just because you say, oh, I'm just going to do 2 server. If you got many of those, it might not be cost effective, not to mention the hardware cost. I'm putting some of the scenarios, whether you're together or apart, of things to look into. Content, I already talked about that. So one thing is I cannot have a farm here with Project Web App, but all those sites in another farm. Or another example is I cannot have my PMO on-prem and with 365 or on-demand hosting in the cloud. We can't cross farms. So really, take this into consideration when you're planning. Web parts already mentioned. You can put some web parts depending on where you are by site collection, by farm. And I've given you the pointers of what can you do and what can't you do. Reporting, back to the questions early, if I get multiple instance reporting, you can go very far. Because again, at the end, it's just data, whether it's a relational database or a decisional database. And we got many tools and reporting services on Excel. So surfacing is typically the easy part. And search, yes, you can search all the document artifacts, all the lists, and in the content DB. And the next question I get is those milestones and tasks. How do I search that? And easiest way is to leverage. I've done a blog post. I use SPD, SharePoint Designers. You can use BCS, Business Connectivity Services, if you want to be fancy. But I just accessing the reporting database, which is supported in the project server world. That's the only one that is supported. So please don't write queries against our published database. And I surface that using fast search, and now I can search. Give me all the resources that are DBA. Give me everyone that went to the attendee party last night, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. What if you write read-only query to? No, so let me be very clear. Can you write a read-only query to do you say reporting database? Publish. Again, I'm going to make it very clear. You heard my word. I'm not going to check what you do back at home. Do not query the publish, the draft, or the draft database. You can only query the reporting database. Now, I know it's just a SQL database, like you can write query against content DB, but that's not supported. It's not supported today. And maybe it'll put you in trouble in the future. So the technical reason is we have all that syncing mechanism, and maybe that query in one point in time might be partially correct because we're syncing data, and that's going to create all sorts of trouble. You might say, yeah, Christophe, it's read-only still. Do not query the published database. And the answer is, we do have an answer, is use our API. There's a session from my colleague after that. Use our web service to do that by the Microsoft rules and extract whatever data you need. Okay, let me move on because I only have 10 minutes left. So capacity planning, I get the idea of together apart. I get what's so special about project server. How many servers? And in our world, obviously, in a SharePoint world, it's more about search and artifacts and documents. In our world, obviously, the number of projects is going to drive how many servers I need, number of tasks, number of resources. Like I say, if you get 10,000 resources, you're going to need a little more muscle than if you get a dozen. And then I put other consideration. The reason I'm going fast, again, I apologize, is we got a great white paper that goes into detail a lot, about a lot of these. A couple things I want to mention that are that are interesting thing. One thing that's going to drive capacity planning is, if that project server is so critical that I'm connecting to TFS, I'm going to connect it to my ERP backend, I'm going to connect it to my CRM system, et cetera, that adds traffic back and forth, whether it's BizTalk or direct web services. So maybe you have to dedicate a box at a middle tier just to do all the handshakes between all those systems where you're pulling and pushing. So really take this into consideration. Virtualization, similar to SharePoint, and I got a slide on that, is if it's done correctly, you should have similar performance as physical servers up to a certain point. And typically, you reach that point where the main bottleneck is the SQL, the database tier. And that's when typically you go virtual, web front end, or business logic, and you go physical for the database tier. We got a lot of guidance. Obviously, there's a one that's planned for using project server using Hyper-V. You might be saying, Christophe, I'm not using Hyper-V. I'm using another product. Well, guess what? It doesn't matter what product or what virtualization. It's the same challenges. And it's the same challenges you have with a physical environment. You got to worry about CPU, RAM, I/O, network card, right? You have a host and you have all those virtual environments. Are they just have one NIC? Are you dedicating? So we've documented that. We've done performance benchmark like we show on stage. If it's done properly, you're good. If it's, let me step back. I was talking to a customer, and typically the way it works is you got someone that manages virtualization, and they just say, oh yeah, here's 2 or 3 virtual servers so you can stand up project server. And then typically the PMO installs it, great, and they say, oh, performance is not so good. And the virtualization say, yeah, I've given you the stuff, Anyway, we've did a webcast with, for instance, how to deploy project server with VMware, not to mention them, it was 2 weeks ago. But it's the same dilemma, if it's not done properly. And typically you've got to educate the person in charge of virtualization and say, here's why you need to really give me a dedicated network card. Here's why, 4 gigabyte is not going to cut it, et cetera, et cetera. So plenty of links. Again, and then one thing I want to mention is because we're built on SharePoint 2010, sometimes if you don't find the exact answer on the project server TechNet, that pretty way of navigating the content, there's a good chance that your answer is in the SharePoint documentation. So that's why a lot of those links you'll see are just straight white paper that the SharePoint team, Bill Bauer on the project marketing team, on the SharePoint marketing team, they just released this white paper. SharePoint virtualization, sorry, it's this last one. This one just came out, I think, in May. A lot of learnings based on what we see people do or not do properly. And so great reminders of make sure you did your homework in terms of architecting this properly in a virtual environment. At the end of the day, people say, Christophe, tell me exactly how many servers I need. I got 3,003 project, I've got 12 resources, I've got 3-year plan, exactly how many servers I need. I say, in our documentation, we've got standard topology. Here's how many servers, small, medium, and large. I say, start small. The beauty about SharePoint 2010 or 2007 is if you're monitoring from day one, you take a baseline when you go live, then you can have a server hot in the farm without taking anything down, right? So if you're seeing suddenly this low, those 2 servers doing Excel services queries or those 2 guys doing project server calculations, they're choking a little bit on CPU, then maybe we should offload or add another servers or beef up those the CPUs, the number of cores on those servers, right? So you're always a step ahead. And yes, we have System Center Management Pack. It's actually part of the SharePoint Management Pack. So if If you got System Center 2007, or if you're using another competitors to monitor things, we got all the perf counters that you should be monitoring. And at the end of the day, like SharePoint, what matters is the SQL tier. So don't sweat too much how many web, front-end, app, server, etc. Really, really architect the SQL tier very well. Give it some strong muscle and shoulders, strong I/O, etc., etc. Typically, because the reason I'm stressing that is making a change on a live SQL tier is a little more sensitive, a little more costly than just popping in web front-end in a farm. So I put the white paper. I know I'm going a little fast, but I want to make sure I wrap up on time. Upgrade, a lot of you raised their hand. Same story as SharePoint. It's a DB attach, meaning I back up the 5 database, the 4 per instance project server database. I back up the content DB. You might be wondering, how about the cube, the OLAP database? You don't need to back it up because we recreated. So I got 5 DB. I put on my thumb drive. I go to my SharePoint 2010 staging environment, not the production environment. And I restore this database, and I just say, create a service app, create an instance. I say, here's my 4 database name, and voila, it's going to detect it's a 12 Hive from a schema. It's going to apply Service Pack 1 if you're at Service Pack 1. June CU, actually August CU just came out. And then suddenly, voila, you're up and running. So hopefully from a database, I think my colleague Jan has done it as in a live demo at TechEd. I think it was like in a couple minutes. But hopefully that's where the fun starts. Migrating the data is the easy part. Then you got to retrain the users, et cetera, et cetera. From 2003, very briefly, same story as SharePoint. You've got to go through 2007 before you're going to go to 2010. So typically, 2007 to 2010, we'll call that an upgrade. 2003 to 2010, we call it a migration because you got to port your data to 2007, and then you got to port it to 2010. And we recommend the DB attach, again, because it's clean. You're really starting from scratch. You're isolating the data. And hopefully the idea is that back on that legacy farm, you've already have all that data in a separate, site collection, content DB, and it's not one massive site collection, which I know no one does with my site, all the sites, et cetera, et cetera. And that's back to my point is, should I go together or apart? The good thing is you get those 5 DBs, and you start on one farm, and again, one day you want to consolidate servers, you just take those 5 DBs. So it's the same process if you want to go from production to staging or one farm to another within the 2010 versions. Yes, question back there.
Yeah, and so if we're running 2007 on the 64-bit, is there a recommendation to do replace or
It's supported. So the question is, how about if we already have 2007 64-bit? It's supported. The problem is, if something goes bad, your farm is done. And typically, the way you want to do is side-by-side, your little user acceptance test. And then you're going to flip a switch, say, OK, this farm is over, or redirect everything to this new farm. In place, you don't have a lot of safety net. But it's absolutely supported. So it depends. How many servers? Is it just the PMO? Is it the intranet, et cetera, et cetera? And hopefully, you get an environment where you're going to test it out before you do the big bang next weekend. Let me just move on. I'll take the questions because I only have a few minutes left. So I put this. You can read that. It talks about the compatibility. A couple of things. Again, based on, thanks to SharePoint 2010, we've really made the IT admin or the consultant easier. You can script everything. We used to have STS, ADM, but PowerShell is really a lot more powerful. I've done it in a couple of minutes to install it from scratch. Typically, what I remind everyone, especially consultants, is installing the app, that's the easy thing when you go to your customer. But what's going to take months and weeks is to make sure this customer has the right .NET framework, the right Windows version, that they get the licenses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we've got very well documented on TechNet. What are all those prereqs that takes ages versus installing is just a breeze. Core items. That's typically, OK, you install it, but typically this is where the fun starts. You need to configure a bunch of things, including, for instance, operations. I know I'm speeding for this, and I apologize. A couple slides on operations. I think probably the title sums it up, but, please, 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 whether you're a SI, sell as part of your statement of work, a disaster recovery plan, please sell monitoring best practices so that your customers or you as IT, you're on top of things. And you don't get the screaming CX in your company saying, I can't do blah, I can't publish the report. And like we have in SharePoint, we got a lot of ULS. We got performance scanners. I already mentioned that. Admin guide, I think it's a 300 pages guide that our technical writers wrote. That's a good starting point on all those activities and configuration settings you can play with. Database is key. Again, monitor it. Backup plan, I put the link. A lot of people ask, how about disaster recovery? How about going from production to staging, moving data around? And I put the usual suspects. Oh yeah, maintenance plan. Not a lot of people know that. Hopefully everyone in the room knows that. But please implement maintenance plan on your back end. We do a lot of transactions, and over time, performance will degrade if you don't show a little love, a little defrag on those databases. Software updates, similar to SharePoint. We ship an SP1 in June, and we continue to ship a cumulative update every 2 months. So last one came in August. Guess when the next one is coming? End of this month, and we'll have one in December. So I put the links, and we actually do, to be proactive, we do webcast every 2 months. We got 2 top-notch engineers that says, I know you can all read knowledge-based article, but I think talking heads a little more fun, and they give their own anecdote on what was that specific bug. So every 2 months, typically 2 weeks after the CU release, we have a webcast saying, here's why you should potentially patch or not patch. I put the list of tools that our support engineer, and that's this guy called Brian Smith, they use when they have customers are running into issue. Things to look at. Obviously, that's a little animation on TechNet. Obviously, Bing search will yield a couple of good nuggets. And the reason I'm stressing that is a lot of you in the room or people have written blogs on, how did I fix this? How did I go around this ask from the business users? I put more tools. Playbook on Project Tool have project server specific tools that help you move data around environment. And as I say, if you like what you see, but you think, you can improve, there's plenty of you, either in the room, there's plenty of you worldwide that have, from a Microsoft perspective, the PPM competency, that have passed exams, etc. Or if you just want to get training, you attend training or train people internally that are going to be managing the server. Just to wrap up, call to action is we will have, similar like SharePoint here, the Microsoft-led project conference next March. So whether you're a system integrator, ISV, you're a PMP, or whoever you want to tell your favorite PMP, I have actually little cards. And you can still win a free entry by just getting scanned at our booth. So Phoenix, great place to be in March. Sunny and great golfs. Sessions, we're at the end. There's one more. In case you miss all the hours, it's all recorded. And I think you're going to get access pretty soon. I think it's next week or so. Get access to all the decks. There's one more about extensibility right after this. To my colleague, resources. And in the end, we're built on SharePoint 2010. But it's an enterprise application, so whether you need to get trained, whether you need to really do a capacity planning study, you need to put in place a disaster recovery plan, you need to put together an operational plan, it's important. Treat it as such. Don't treat it as just a simple install and here you go PMO, you're off and running. Thank you very much for your time. I apologize for being over time.